Welcome to the Naval Postgraduate School Center for Homeland Defense and Security lecture and webinar series. On behalf of CHDS and our co-hosts, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, Big City Emergency Managers, the Governor's Homeland Security Advisors Council, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the International Association of Emergency Managers, the National Governors Association, the CHDS Alumni Association, and the Naval Postgraduate School Foundation and Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're kicking off a two-part webinar series exploring international and domestic threats confronting America and our homeland security. In today's discussion, we will focus on the international landscape and the geopolitical threats that the U.S. will face. Next week, on Thursday, March 24th, our experts will consider America's domestic threats, asking whether those are connected to international geopolitical players that we're seeing now, and discussing how Homeland Security professionals can do their jobs in a hyper-polarized environment. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for today's webinar. First, our moderator, Mike Walker. Mike is a subject matter expert at CHDS and a frequent lecturer here as well, where he focuses on all hazard threats. Mike served 32 years in the federal government and was confirmed 4 times by the US Senate, serving in senior executive branch positions. At the Pentagon, Mike was the acting Secretary of the Army, Undersecretary of the Army, and in several other key national security positions. Mike served as Deputy Director of FEMA and as Undersecretary of Veterans Affairs for Memorial Affairs as well, before he retired from the federal government. Mike began his career on Capitol Hill as a page in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he later served as staff director for the Senate Subcommittee on Military Construction Appropriations. And Mike was one of the founders for CHDS, so we welcome him back with great honor to moderate today's discussion. And our featured guest today is Dr. Seth Jones. Seth is an instructor of comparative government for Homeland Security here at CHDS. He's also the Senior Vice President, the Harold Brown Chair, and the Director of International Security Programs at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS. Seth was the Director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at the RAND Corporation, and he also served as representative for the commander of the U.S. Special Operations Command to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. Seth specializes in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, unconventional warfare, and covert actions. And he's authored several books and journal articles on all of these topics. Just today, Seth moderated an online discussion with 4 former NATO Supreme Allied Commanders of Europe discussing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Seth, thank you for joining us today and bringing insights from that conversation and your own expertise as we talk about geopolitical threats and what those can mean for the nation's homeland security community. Mike, now I'd like to turn it over to you to kick off our program.
Thank you very much, Dawn. It's a great honor to join Seth Jones for this very timely discussion. Seth, as we begin, some of us may be wondering exactly how geopolitical threats impact what we do every day as Homeland Security practitioners. So could you set the stage for this discussion by talking about how geopolitical threats could directly impact the homeland?
Thanks, Mike, for moderating this session. Thanks for your great service to the country. And thanks to Dawn and the entire CHDS crew for all the great work that they've done. And it's a real honor to be here with you, Mike. I think it's really important to start off by connecting what goes on overseas to what goes on inside the U.S. homeland. So there are a lot of ways that connection is important. I'll just briefly touch on 4. The first is cyber operations. We certainly know that offensive cyber operations, both targeting U.S. critical infrastructure, conducting espionage inside of the U.S. on cyber platforms is a significant and a growing concern. We've seen critical infrastructure, including elements of pipelines, Colonial Pipeline targeted with ransomware attacks. We've seen Greeley Beef and other U.S. corporations. We've obviously seen U.S. government targeted in offensive cyber. And then obviously we've seen key elements of the Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and other intelligence services. In the Russian case, the GRU, the main intelligence directorate, the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Agency, the Chinese, it's the Ministry of State Security, their external intelligence agency, the People's Liberation Army, and other organizations involved in offensive cyber operations inside of the U.S. homeland. So that's one. A second is disinformation and misinformation on U.S. platforms. That can range from attempting to influence elections. We've seen it over the course of the Cold War, not just more recently, but the effort to influence elections, to sow just general disorder on U.S. platforms. And again, what's important, I think, to understand is that most of the U.S.'s major adversaries, really all of them, are authoritarian regimes. So an important goal is to undermine democracy. So the more you can raise questions about the viability of democracy, the more you can attempt to encourage, take advantage of polarization in the U.S. political system, divides over issues like gun control, the more it weakens or potentially weakens the U.S. democratic and political system. So that's a second. The third is we've seen attempts to conduct subversion or sabotage inside of the U.S. or affecting the U.S. directly. Probably one of the more recent interesting examples is the Russian maritime vessels earlier this year off the coast of Ireland. In the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, those maritime vessels were within very close proximity, purposefully, to the fiber optic networks that go under the Atlantic between Europe, in this case, off the coast of Ireland, and North America. So that's an act of sabotage and subversion that a foreign adversary could certainly take, that would undermine that, in that case, the key communications, strategic communications nodes. And then a fourth is we can even see events like the war in Ukraine impacting supply chain, impacting oil and gas prices. We can all see that in the price at the pump. So that is a kind of a secondary impact on U.S. economy and aspects along those lines. So the point here, Mike, is that there are a range of different things that geopolitical threats, actions, invasions could take that would impact us here on the homeland.
Seth, last week, U.S. intelligence officials testified before Congress that Ukraine is a war that Vladimir Putin cannot afford to lose. Do you agree with that? And how does Putin win in Ukraine?
Well, Mike, it's obviously a very important question right now. It looks like, as much as we can tell based on some preliminary information that's come from Russia's domestic intelligence agency, the FSB, that has leaked out, and some other sources, including ones that the U.S. government has collected and then provided publicly, that the hope was that Vladimir Putin, in invading Ukraine, could do it relatively quickly, potentially secure a regime change, and turn Ukraine from a pro-Western back to a pro-Russian, so a pre-2014, pre-2013, pre-2012 regime. That has not happened. In fact, quite the opposite. So whatever position Vladimir Putin was in the early part of 2022, he is now in a position where he can't afford, I think, to lose, at least to lose big. Just to highlight, there are more Russian combat deaths in the first 2.5 weeks of the war, about 6,000 to 8,000, based on my discussions yesterday with senior U.S. intelligence officials. More Russian combat deaths in that 2.5 weeks period than in Ukraine than in the entire 20-year period combined U.S. combat deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, they're slightly different situations. I'm not intending to mix apples and oranges here, but I'm just trying to give a sense of the combat fatalities that the Russians have faced. They're really extraordinary. Again, more Russian combat deaths in 2.5 weeks than we've seen in 20 years combined US in Iraq and Afghanistan. So there's that. And that's going to be hard, I think, for the Russians to sustain over a prolonged period of time. We did see it was an existential issue for the Russians by about the mid-1980s, which is why they had to eventually pull out of Afghanistan and why their entire empire, in part, crumbled. There are the economic sanctions that are significantly crippling Russia's economy right now. We're seeing rising inflation. We're seeing significant problems of access to money, Russian money. The Russians are on the verge of a default. So there's a huge economic crisis. And then even politically, we've seen not just within Europe, but within other areas of the globe, the Russians will not be participating in the most important athletic event this year for most of the world, which is the World Cup of soccer or football. They've been kicked out. So, I mean, politically, economically, and militarily, this is now a big, potentially existential struggle for Vladimir Putin. So whatever he intended to do at the beginning of 2022, he is now in a very serious position that if he cannot extricate his military, find a way to get out of the economic and political crisis that he's in, his future is certainly in some doubt. So how does he win in Ukraine, you asked, Mike? I think at this point, at the very least, if he can minimize Russian fatalities in Ukraine, and if he can find a way to focus on at least some kind of a political win for his population, maybe he can secure the Russians have already seized Crimea in areas in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk. If he can essentially secure those, if he can essentially get, and we've already heard the Ukrainians start to talk about this recently, essentially a position of neutrality, so they commit not to become members of NATO, that might be good enough to salvage Putin. That it's not a win, really, but it's not a loss. And I don't think Putin can afford a big loss right now.
Yeah, he clearly understood the ability of his military, and he misunderstood the ability of the West to pour on quick economic sanctions. They've never seen anything like it because we've never done sanctions like that before, and there's still more we can do. So his economy
and he also misunderstood, Mike, he also misunderstood what is an incredible heroic effort by the Ukrainian population and President Zelensky to fight the Russians. I mean, IT professionals, cab drivers, they have all taken up weapons to fight the foreign invader. It appears that the Russians were not prepared for that kind of response.
Yeah, that was probably his biggest mistake. So now he has a declining economy that some economists believe could mean a 15% reduction in GDP this year. It's going to have severe setbacks for every Russian in that country, including people who are very close to Putin. How does he survive that as the economy continues to tank?
Well, I mean, we have seen regimes survive tanking economies. Both the North Korean and Iranian regimes have survived extraordinary sanctions by the West. The Iranian example is just the most recent extraordinary sanctions by the Europeans, and particularly by the United States, across the board, which have targeted military, economic, banking facilities, and even individuals within the Iranian government. Iranian leaders, including the now deceased head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, who was killed by the US in early 2020, and his successor, were and have been sanctioned. What has happened, I think, in those examples, and this is where it is possible that Putin may be able to get some outside assistance, is the Iranian economy, as bad as it is right now, has at least gotten some help by selling oil, for example, to foreign countries, including the Chinese. There are some Latin American countries that have purchased Iranian oil. There's also a black market in supplies. So if the Russians over time can get some economic assistance from the Chinese, which it does look like the Chinese are willing to provide some assistance. The military assistance question still is a bit of a bit of a question mark right now, but that can at least help ameliorate some of the economic problems that Russia will have. And again, if we look at those Iranian, North Korean examples, the respective leaders, the supreme leader of Iran and in North Korea as well, survived extraordinary sanctions and a catastrophic economy. So it is feasible. They just need help by countries to break those sanctions. And again, 1.4 billion Chinese or the Indians, in addition, another billion would be vastly helpful to the Russians.
Yeah, earlier you mentioned the Russian history in Afghanistan. Over the years, I have met some of Russia's military and civilian leaders, and every one of them had long, haunting memories of what happened to Russian troops during the 1980s in Afghanistan. But when you look at what Putin's military faces today in Ukraine, it actually has the makings of a quagmire much worse than what they faced in Afghanistan. How does Putin deal with that?
Well, we saw the Russians struggle in Chechnya in the first phase of that conflict. We saw the Russians struggle a little bit in the early weeks and months, and probably a year or two of the Syrian war. They began to get involved in the fall of 2015 in Syria. They didn't really send a large maneuver element. It was mostly Russian aircraft that were dropping bombs. It was Russian maritime vessels that were shooting, for example, Caliber cruise missiles at targets. And the maneuver element on the ground was included Syrian units, Lebanese Hezbollah, Palestinian, Afghan, Iraqi militias, and others that had been trained in part by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Quds Force, the main Iranian paramilitary organization. And they did get somewhat better over time. The upside for the Russians, though, in Chechnya was that that was Russian territory. The Chechen terrorists conducted attacks in Moscow. They conducted just a horrific attack in Beslan against a school. So that added to the support of the Russian population, really, to conduct a scorched earth campaign in Chechnya. In Syria, they didn't really lose combat forces. They didn't really lose many soldiers. They did lose some contractors, including Wagner Group, the Russian private military company that the U.S. military killed, about 300 or so in a strike in eastern Syria. But the problem
first, they attacked us first, and we responded.
They attacked us first. Absolutely, they threatened U.S. forces. The U.S. I talked to the U.S. commander on the ground. They reached out to the Russian Ministry of Defense and warned the Russians that they were going to strike Russian private military contractors. The MOD folks on the other line said these aren't ours. That was all we needed, and the U.S. struck those Russian private military contractors that were actually operating under the auspices of the Russian Ministry of Defense. But the challenge, Mike, you mentioned Afghanistan in the 1980s. The challenge in Ukraine right now is in some ways very similar. Again, unlike the situation in Chechnya, Russian territory, big strikes in cities like Moscow by Chechen terrorists, unlike Ukraine, where the Russians really didn't bleed. Unlike Syria, the Russians didn't bleed. In Ukraine, the Russians started this war. Really, they started the war, you can talk about the expansion of NATO, but the Russian initiative was to start the war, and they're the ones that are bleeding in extraordinary ways. So it is, in some ways, there's a close proximity to the Afghan war. States outside of Afghanistan are providing assistance. It was the CIA during the Afghan wars, and Pakistan and the Saudis and the Israelis providing weapons, ammunition, and the US also with Stingers. In the case of Ukraine today, it's the US providing javelins, it's providing Stingers also. It's the British have provided NLAWs, so lots of anti-tank, surface-to-air missiles, ammunition. And I think the challenge then is Putin's going to have to find a way, frankly, to extricate his actual combat forces out of Ukraine, and again to declare some kind of victory. He could pull back those forces into the Donbass area, where there is some more support from a somewhat of a pro-Russian population there. That's still Ukrainian territory. And what he gets is he'll have leveled chunks of Ukraine, the cities. It will send a message to other countries like the Georgians that they may want to think twice about NATO membership. That, in my view, is about the only way he can really start to extricate himself, is to move back to territory that his forces can defend. If he keeps bleeding at the level his forces are bleeding right now, I think he puts himself as Russian leader in serious long-term risk.
Well, there's concern that if they do keep bleeding, that he may be like a cornered animal and lash out. And NATO and U.S. officials have already raised concerns that he might use chemical weapons. And on more than one occasion, Putin himself has raised the specter of nuclear weapons. Do you believe he could actually use a battlefield nuclear weapon? And if he does, how will the West prevent further escalation?
Mike, I think the more likely near-term option right now is the use of chemical, probably not biological, but probably chemical weapons. They've been used in combat operations recently. The Syrians used them. That was a war that the Russians were involved in. They were tactically used to clear neighborhoods, and the use of chemical weapons, including sarin or chlorine. But take sarin. If you use sarin in an attack in a neighborhood and it gets out pretty quickly that there were chemical weapons used, obviously it's illegal under international law, but that is a way to clear out those neighborhoods quickly. People will get out when there are chemical weapons that have been used, or where there's the potential that a chemical weapon had been used. So I think that's probably more likely. The Russians were instrumental in providing political support to the Assad regime after it used chemical weapons multiple times. It made it very difficult, if not impossible, to do any kind of an investigation of the chemical attacks that the Assad regime used. So it was involved in the cover-up. It was involved in almost certainly at least giving a yellow light to the use of chemical weapons. So there are some tactical reasons, again, illegal, but tactical reasons why countries have used chemical weapons in the past. I mean, the US has, even in Vietnam. So I think that's probably more likely.
We don't have any more, though.
We don't have any more. Yes, and they do. So I think that's more like I've been involved in war games, Mike, and others may on this call have been involved in war games where the Russians have used, war game scenario where the Russian side has used tactical nuclear weapons, but it's generally in a Baltic scenario where there's a war around the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. There are ground forces there that the Russians are concerned may move on Russian territory, including Kaliningrad, or into Russian territory, possibly moving against Russian cities. And in a case like that, where they're advancing ground forces in war games, the Russian side, the red side, has used tactical nuclear weapons. But that's a very different scenario from what we're seeing in Ukraine. So I think it's unlikely. It's not out of the question, particularly if Putin really feels like he needs to send a message that will keep him in power. Otherwise, he will lose power. Maybe under that circumstance, but I don't think we're there yet.
That's good to hear. In your last session with the four stars, General Clark mentioned that he believes that there are people, if ordered in the military, if ordered by Putin, would not press the button.
Yeah, that I've heard that from several people. Obviously, it's in part a hypothetical argument. We don't know exactly what the Russians will do in a circumstance where Vladimir Putin will want the use of tactical nuclear weapons, and whether, even if you were to get senior Russian leaders, whether it was the defense minister Shoigu or Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the army staff, were to say no, that he would find someone willing and able to say yes and to use those nuclear weapons. So, again, not clear whether, if we got to that point, whether there would be at least some individuals willing to use them if Putin demanded.
Right. Seth, your CSIS team has done some great work producing 3 volumes called The Kremlin Playbook. They're really good. People ought to take a look at them. The most recent one dealt with the relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state. The leader of the church, Patriarch Kirill, and Vladimir Putin are very close. In recent years, the Patriarch has not only been warning about an existential threat posed by so-called Western decadence, but he has also been preaching that the end times have already begun. So my question is, do we have any idea how Patriarch Kirill is influencing Vladimir Putin during this current crisis?
Well, I think what we can say is the Orthodox Church, including the Patriarch, do have an influence, not just on Putin, but have a broader influence throughout Russia. And to the extent that the church has a broader influence in Europe and other locations. And I think what's important here is to understand that during the Cold War, under the communist Soviet Union, it was the ideology that was sort of at the core of Russian influence was Marxism-Leninism. And so when it came to what was the ideology around the Soviet state, that ideology was, we saw the expansion of influence overseas in support for Marxist-Leninist groups overseas. Well, the Soviet Union collapsed, and so did Marxism-Leninism for the most part in what's now the former Soviet Union. And so the Orthodox Church has become an important, not the important, but an important source of influence. Heather Connolly and her Kremlin Playbook team called it strategic conservatism. What it means is that the Russian Orthodox Church is an important ideological influencer within Russia, within the Kremlin, and overseas in promoting Russian interests. And that's within the church, in sermons, and then in just general statements that the Patriarch makes. So we've seen those statements get into validation for the invasion of Ukraine. We've seen that the Patriarch comments about concern about NATO expansion, Western decadence. So the church's role has been essentially to be a key ideological support base for Vladimir Putin, to his population and to some populations overseas, in ways that attempt to influence the balance of power in Russia's favor. So again, important on the ideological front and very important for attempting to influence. Again, how successful the church has been definitely been mixed.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Putin expected his war to be over very quickly, and he did. He clearly underestimated the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people. And he also expected the West to be divided, but the West is not divided. In recent weeks, we have seen a revitalization of NATO. We've seen unprecedented unity in Europe and rare bipartisanship here in the United States. My question is, though, can all of that be sustained if there is a long war?
That's a very good question. Obviously, it's unclear how long that can be sustained. I think U.S. leadership is actually quite important in answering that question. A continuing Russian threat, if the Russians continue to conduct military operations, the invasion of Ukraine, continue to conduct the atrocities we're seeing in Ukrainian cities, and if they're able to get away with it, even if they're not, if they decide to go elsewhere, if they decide to threaten the Baltic states, Finland and Sweden are not NATO members, but there have been a lot of questions about whether Sweden should become a member of NATO. And so we've seen more of a debate within that population. We've also seen the Russians fly fighter aircraft over Swedish territory, essentially as a threat to the Swedes. So I think the more the Russians operate like this way, like this, the more it will tend to continue to bring not just NATO countries, but other European countries outside of NATO. The Swiss have supported sanctions. They're not a NATO country. They've been historically neutral. So I think what I've seen in NATO is an important revitalization. There are other important aspects of that, Mike, too. I mean, the Germans have responded relatively quickly. Just over the past 2.5 weeks, they've already not just said they're going to increase the percentage of their GDP, their gross domestic product for defense, over the 2% NATO threshold, but they're also announced over the last few days the additional purchase of 5th generation F-35s, which can, I mean, as we're seeing now with some of the older Ukrainian fighter jets, F-35 would be much more effective to operate inside of that air defense bubble in a country like Ukraine with Russian S-400 systems operating there. So I think what all this suggests to me is that there is a significant push by countries within NATO to spend more money on defense, for non-NATO countries to become deeply concerned about Russian activity. And I think this is an important opportunity for the U.S. to have leadership here in continuing to bring together NATO countries to face a serious Russian threat and also to face a serious Chinese threat. Most recent NATO defense papers have also highlighted the Chinese threat. So NATO can serve multiple purposes as well.
Roger. Seth, unless there is a diplomatic breakthrough, the likelihood is this is going to be a long war. So Ukrainians need not only courage, they've got plenty of that, they also need supplies. This weekend, the Russians publicly threatened to attack NATO supply lines. And they did attack a military facility in Ukraine near the Polish border. So I've got two questions. First, will we be able to protect supply routes as Russia continues to take more territory? And what else do we need to be doing in terms of what do we need to be providing the Ukrainians?
So first, Mike, let me just note that the supply lines are incredibly important right now. That in order to continue to resist the Russian invasion and Russian forces, the Ukrainians militarily need sophisticated weapons. They need Stingers and other surface-to-air missiles. There are other advanced systems, including the S-300s that the Ukrainians use. They could use more of, part because the Russians have struck them. advanced anti-tank weapons systems, including Stingers and NLAWs. And then there are a whole range of other types of military, say ammunition, small arms, explosives for targeting Russian tanks, armored personnel carriers that will be important to sustain. And the sustainment is important because the Russians will continue to take out Ukrainian equipment, and Ukrainians will run out of, as they've done already, run out of ammunition. And what's important here is also that it's not just the Stinger shoulder-launched missiles; it's the whole system that's important. Some of the packages, when I've talked to Ukrainians, they may get the shoulder-launched missile, but not necessarily the battery or the coolant that goes with it. So the whole package is important. I mean, obviously, in addition to that, it's also important to provide that the non-military assistance, food, fuel, petroleum oil, lubricants that vehicles need, and then clothing and water and medical supplies, all of that. Just the humanitarian stuff. So that's important. So second is the reality is that the Russians do not have sufficient military presence either in the air or on the ground to block or even significantly interdict those supplies coming in from Poland and other NATO countries. They just don't. There's no wall that's been built. The Russians don't even have a major force presence in Western Ukraine at all. So I recognize, and I don't want to understate the strikes that the Russians have conducted, but these are pinprick strikes against what is a huge supply line coming in. They will never, ever be able to interdict without a serious presence and without concertina wire, building a wall. They will never be able to interdict, in part because, as we've seen the US and NATO countries already start to do, they're hiding the kinds of those weapon systems. They're pulling them apart, putting them on multiple different trucks, getting them in smaller vans and vehicles, moving them through supply lines or rat lines across the Polish-Ukrainian border, and then moving them on various roadways into Ukraine for final destination. The Russians will never, just think for a moment, in my deployments in Afghanistan, we could never fully interdict. That was with 100,000 plus US forces and several 100,000 Afghan forces. We couldn't even interdict the supplies going to the Taliban. There is no way that the Russians are going to be able to do that in enemy hostile territory. So that's a second thing here. The third thing, just to end with, one of the things that struck me, Mike, in the interview with all the four Supreme Allied commanders in the session, I'd strongly urge others to watch that. It's Generals Ralston, Clark, Breedlove, and then Jones. All of them were Supreme Allied commanders, Europe, SACEURs, and then a few of them, like General Jones, was also the National Security Advisor, so he was in the White House. All of them, all four of them, agreed that the U.S. and broadly NATO should be willing to provide air and other necessary cover for humanitarian assistance inside of Ukraine. All agreed that the U.S. should provide air cover. That means flying fixed-wing aircraft, combat aircraft in Ukraine for humanitarian assistance. And all of them collectively argued that this is not Russian territory. This is Ukrainian territory. And if the Ukrainians are asking for humanitarian relief, and if that relief can be protected by US or other NATO aircraft and frankly vehicles potentially under a broader humanitarian auspices, then we can do that. And as General Jones said, this is interesting, he said, I'm tired of having US politicians say what we can't do. I want to hear people talking about what we can do. Providing air cover for humanitarian assistance is something we did in the Balkans. Yes, it certainly risks an escalation, but it is worth doing because we are providing assistance to a local population on the ground that is suffering enormously. So again, interesting to hear, those are all Americans, all four-star generals, all agreeing unanimously that the U.S. should provide that kind of assistance. Now, people can disagree with that, but it was interesting just to hear that we're certainly moving in that direction.
Yeah, I suspect that when the NATO heads of state meet in Brussels next week, that's going to be high on the discussion, and it needs to be. Yes, it does. One final question directly on Ukraine before we move on to other areas of the world. There have been some indications today that Ukrainian and Russian negotiators may be making progress on a peace plan, a 15-point peace plan. But earlier than that today, Vladimir Putin did not sound like a man who was in a peacemaking mood. So under what circumstances do you think Putin might be willing to stop this war?
Well, I do think President Putin would be willing to stop this war today, Mike, under his terms.
Yeah.
And so the challenge for the US and NATO and other allies is to support the Ukrainians here and to support what, the question here is, what are the Ukrainians willing to accept, and how can the US and NATO support it? I think Vladimir Putin would like, to start the war, he wanted a regime change in Ukraine. I think he recognizes that that's going to be very hard to accomplish right now. He may want strategically important territory within Ukraine. His forces have pushed up from Crimea and either controlled or partially controlled some towns and cities or parts of cities in the south, including Mariupol. He's controlled some neighborhoods in areas of the north and the east as well. But I think the challenge is that he's not been able, and the way that Russian diplomacy worked in Syria was to continue military operations and diplomacy at the same time, but to continue to advance militarily. So Moscow's bargaining position actually improved over time because its battlefield successes improved. Well, that has not happened much. I think he's still hoping for a military breakthrough, potentially in the south. If those forces can push through in southern Ukraine and then get up and encircle Kyiv and take Kyiv, I sense that Putin is still hoping that he's able to make more military progress in Ukraine, which improves his bargaining position. But again, every day that goes by with Russian casualties, including fatalities, the harder that's going to be. And I think the question is will the Ukrainians and the Russians be able to find some common ground? Zelensky has said he would possibly entertain neutrality for Ukraine. So I think that the more that the Russians struggle in Ukraine, the more that it opens up possibilities for diplomacy. I think diplomacy will fail in the near term if we start to see Russian success on the battlefield.
Yeah, turning to China before we finish, just before the Olympics, Putin and Xi met and signed a friendship agreement to counter the influence of the United States. And what I don't understand, I've been surprised, frankly, that Putin and Xi have developed what appears to be a very close relationship, because I don't see Putin bringing too much to the deal. His economy is only the size of the economy of the state of Texas. He has nothing to offer. Russia is, if they didn't have nuclear weapons, all they would be is a struggling regional power. So where does China stand in relation to this war in Ukraine? And are there limits to their so-called friendship agreement?
Well, I think at the end of the day, every state, including both Moscow and Beijing, are primarily motivated by self-interest. There have been common interests in both Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin to balance against the West, the US, the Europeans, And then you can add the South Koreans, Japanese, Australians in the Pacific. The Russians and Chinese are authoritarian regimes. They attempt to control their people and information that goes to them. They obviously don't have democratic elections. So from an ideological standpoint, more similarities there than with democratically elected countries in the West, open systems, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. So I think those issues sort of continue to bring the Russians and the Chinese together. And Mike, just to add to your point, though, whatever partnership the Russians might have provided the Chinese, the Russian economy is even worse than it started out, much worse than it started out. Its ground forces and its military have proven to be ineffective against a population of only about 44 million. The Russians have really stumbled in Ukraine. And then politically, the Russians are increasingly politically isolated right now. So it's not a very strong neighbor and friend and ally right now. Nevertheless, what Xi Jinping almost certainly doesn't want to come out of this war is a much stronger NATO, a much stronger United States, and a much weaker Russia, weaker economically, weaker politically, weaker militarily, because that begins to shift the global balance of power out of China's favor and into the West's right now. It's a stronger US and European military relationship and economic relationship, including NATO. NATO is stronger than it was the beginning of 2022. So this is where I think at the end of the day, Xi Jinping may try to salvage the Russians before they're beaten too badly, if that's what the end game looks like, because that does change the global balance of power in ways that's probably not in China's interest.
Yeah, some observers have thought that, China has been watching this closely, thinking that, well, maybe this is a precedent for us taking action against another democracy on Taiwan. So how far do you believe China is willing to go against Taiwan, and under what circumstances might China attack Taiwan?
Well, look, I think the Chinese position on Taiwan is very clear. They believe Taiwan is part of China. They strongly support a one China, not a two China policy. And they will be willing to use force to defend that if necessary. For example, if Taiwan were to declare independence formally, I think that would probably be a casus belli for Beijing. The challenge for Beijing, I think, right now is the military strategy is what they call active defense. So I think for the moment, the Chinese are willing to continue to build up their military, the People's Liberation Army. They are building much more capable fifth generation aircraft. They're building aircraft carriers. They're building submarines. So they're not at a point yet. The Chinese military is not at a point yet where it has surpassed, and it may not get to that, but has not surpassed U.S. conventional or nuclear might. U.S. still has significant air and naval capabilities in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits, as well as some amphibious marine capabilities and some army capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. U.S. also has allies in the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, and even the Indians to some degree, operating with some of those countries under the Quad framework. So in that sense, I think, and watching the way that economic sanctions have been used really to pummel the Russian economy, I suspect all of that together right now, China's still rising, at least in their view. Sanctions have decimated the Russian economy. I'd be surprised, barring some kind of broader wild card scenario like a Taiwanese declaration of independence, that China would now move against Taiwan. I think it appears from translated senior strategic Chinese material, they believe time is on their side. They will eventually surpass the US, and that there will be a time and a place to fully integrate Taiwan, but now is not the time to do that. But time, I think the Chinese do believe is on their side.
Yeah, China, though, still will be our main geopolitical competitor in the 21st century. So how do we keep focus on China while dealing with a rogue like Russia?
Well, I think, and again, it's worth listening to the 4 Supreme Allied Commanders talk about this issue. The U.S. has, in its previous national defense strategies and military strategies, has not just focused historically on one major theater, but at least in this case, 2 major theaters, probably plus concerns action against Iran. That's more of an irregular war and irregular activity. The Iranians don't really have a major conventional capability. It's more on their missile programs and their Islamic Revolutionary Guards Quds Force. So I think the focus here is the Indo-Pacific, and particularly China, will remain a major focus of the U.S., both for actions in the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese also have a Belt and Road Initiative and military power projection capabilities in South Asia, in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. They're building bases in Africa as well. So there's trade, including military arms transfers to Latin America. So the U.S. can focus on balancing and competing with the Chinese economically, technologically, politically, militarily, globally, including within the U.S. homeland, where we see Confucius Institutes, 1,000 Talents program, inside of the United States, disinformation campaigns, cyber operations. Remember, the Chinese were the ones heavily involved in the OPM, the Office of Personnel Management breach, which took my information on security clearances. Then they followed that up with other offensive cyber attacks, including Equifax, which also impacted me and half of Americans. So there's a way, I think, in all those areas to continue to compete with China and defend and counter Chinese activity, but also to work with our NATO allies and our European partners in Europe against Russian activity. And Mike, this is where I think the U.S. cannot operate alone. It needs allies and partners globally. In Europe, that is NATO. NATO is the bedrock of U.S. defense and deterrence in Europe, and does bring in important allies like the UK, which is not a member of the European Union anymore, but is a bulwark member of NATO. And in the Pacific, against the Chinese, again, it's the South Koreans, the Republic of Korea, it's the Japanese, it's the Australians, it's the Indians and other countries. So the U.S. cannot compete with these countries by themselves. It does need the support of its democratic allies and partners. I think that will be important to keep those and foster them. And the programs like AUKUS, helping the Australians build nuclear submarines, is a key aspect of that, not just because of the submarines, but it's a way to share that sensitive technology now between the U.S., the Australians, and the British, all 3 members of AUKUS.
Right. Dawn tells me she has some great questions from the audience. Before we turn there, just briefly, you mentioned Iran. Anything you want to say about North Korea? It sounds like they're about to have another big ICBM test.
Well, again, this is a good example of, I think, with all the focus we've had on the Russian economy and the sanctions, that we've had sanctions in place for decades in North Korea, yet that regime continues to repress its population. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. And on the military side, we see them continue to advance their weapons, and not just weapons, but they have nuclear weapons, and they continue to advance the scope of their missile capabilities to launch nuclear weapons. So I think it's going to be continue to be important to counter North Korean activity. they're not a global power. They're barely a regional power. I mean, they're a bankrupt economy, but they certainly are a major threat to some countries in the Indo-Pacific, including Korea, which is where the U.S. has a significant number of forces. So I think it will be important to continue to counter North Korean belligerence in the Indo-Pacific.
And many of the malware attacks in this country and around the world that some of our police departments, hospitals pay cryptocurrency for go straight into their program.
Absolutely. Ransomware attacks, Mike. The Sony attack came from the North Koreans, and that was targeting the state of California. So yes, definitely.
Well, Dawn, back to you for questions from the audience.
Thanks, Mike. Seth, you've mentioned during the course of today's broadcast several options that the U.S. might choose to pursue to increase their support for Ukraine. We have probably 30 questions here about how that might be seen by Vladimir Putin as escalating our involvement, and specifically what you think that might look like in a cyber attack back on the U.S. You and Mike certainly have talked about that, but how likely might that be, and how might the Homeland Security leaders on this broadcast, how might they see that manifesting itself here in the homeland?
Well, look, the U.S. is already providing, as is NATO and other countries, significant military assistance to the Ukrainian government. So, I mean, I'm not sure Putin can consider it escalation. I think the challenge, though, is that his forces are dying in relatively significant numbers right now. So that is what is causing him to lash out. That's what caused him to strike the military facility near the Polish border in Western Ukraine. And I think assuming his forces continue to struggle to not just conquer, but to hold territory, the ratio of Russian forces to population is tiny. There are about 4 Russian soldiers for every 1,000 Ukrainian inhabitants. That number is notably smaller than what any military doctrine would tell you, which is much closer in the Balkans. Ratios were about 20 U.S. and European forces per every 1,000 inhabitants. World War II, by the end of World War II, it was 101 U.S. forces per every German inhabitant. So the Russian force numbers are tiny. What it means is they can't hold any territory that they conquer. And I think that with that problem, I think what we're likely to see is the Russians lashing out, sabotage and subversion. We've talked about the fiber optic networks in and around Ireland or Norway, Svalbard, where there are additional fiber optic network cables that have been threatened. Offensive cyber operations. I mean, I will tell you, without talking in detail on an unclassified line here, is that U.S. agencies, including NSA, have been operating in overdrive to protect U.S. systems, not just in the U.S., but overseas, including in Ukraine, which have been the target of very aggressive Russian GRU and SVR offensive cyber operations. But I would expect that the more that the Russians struggle, the more they will attempt to lash out. Now, there are definitely some red lines that U.S. political leaders should be signaling. One would hypothesize that if the Russians, and I think it would be likely, had malware in U.S. critical infrastructure, that the U.S. might have malware in Russian critical infrastructure. And there is a rough parallel to the nuclear deterrence of the Cold War, what we called mutually assured destruction, which is if you hit our critical infrastructure, we will hit yours. And that acted as quite a deterrent during the Cold War, which is why we never saw the Soviets launch nuclear missiles at U.S. cities, because of the U.S.'s second strike capability. There is a rough parallel in the in the cyber world. It just has to be communicated, not always necessarily publicly, but at least privately. I certainly think if we were to see, as the 4 Supreme Allied Commanders suggested, U.S. aircraft move into Ukraine to protect humanitarian convoys, that the Russians would probably consider that escalation. Again, I think as those 4 Supreme Allied commanders said pretty firmly, this is not Russian territory. This is Ukrainian territory. And these would be Ukrainian government officials asking for US and broader NATO assistance to support a humanitarian effort. If the Russians consider that escalation and they target, that's their decision. But that is the right thing to do, they said. So that does get into a possible movement up the escalatory ladder. I think there's no question, and the US would have to prepare for that.
Mike, we have several questions here, and I'm going to actually pose those to you. You spent a meaningful part of your career on U.S. Capitol Hill, and several folks have asked, well, do you see a meaningful path forward for bipartisanship as President Zelensky addressed Congress in a video address today asking for more and increased U.S. support? Do you see a path forward? And if so, what might that look like from congressional leadership and the White House?
Well, I have since after Zelensky made his speech, I've talked to several people on the Hill in both parties. And I am amazed at the bipartisanship that seems to be developing. Now, Mitch McConnell had a statement complaining about the president today before he made his statement. But you're always going to have that. But behind the scenes, they are working together better than I have seen in years, quite frankly. And because clearly, except for small numbers of people in the United States, everyone sees Vladimir Putin to be the enemy of the United States. And that translates into bipartisanship on the Hill. So I think we're going to be seeing more cooperation, particularly as Putin gets more brutal as he attacks these cities. People are going to be horrified by it. And that's going to bring the politicians closer together.
Being mindful of time, I have one final set of audience questions that I'd actually like to pose to both of you, and maybe Mike to you first, and then let's take a swing at it as well. Several questions about how both Russia and the US and allied partners might use media, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, or other honest and forthright media campaigns to inform the Russian populace outside of Russian-controlled media channels what's happening in Ukraine, and how that might also be used against the US in disinformation to maybe expound upon some of our own internal divides. Mike, thoughts on that? And then I'll let Seth take a swing at that as well.
Well, it's already happening here in the United States, and we may get into more of that discussion in our next seminar when we talk about threats and domestic threats. So yes, it is already happening to a high level. But again, I think, people, the majority of Americans are learning how to tell the difference between misinformation and truth. And particularly when it relates to someone as evil as Vladimir Putin and what he's trying to accomplish. So it's, they initially wrote the book on it through the Internet Research Agency in 2014, which originally did not attack Europe and the United States. It attacked Ukraine. That's how they learned how to use misinformation. But the truth is, the best use of correct information and truth is what Zelensky has been doing. It just puts the Russian effort for misinformation to shame.
Seth, thoughts on media use?
Yeah, just two quick things. One is I actually think the U.S. did a pretty good job early on in January and February leading up to the invasion of getting ahead of what was going to be and what had already started to be Russian disinformation campaign about Ukraine, about neo-Nazis, about it wasn't going to invade. And the US and the British declassified intelligence about the buildup, about the rough timeline for the invasion, about the use of sabotage and subversion, named individuals that the Russians had were considering that could replace Zelensky as puppet leaders in Kyiv. And I think that actually threw off Putin's efforts to really control the narrative. So I think that's important, and it's important to continue. And I actually think it's really important what the Russians were able to successfully do in Chechnya is stifle media coverage of the war. They actually killed some journalists. It was within Russian territory, so they didn't allow generally objective journalists into the war zone. And then in Syria, it's the same thing, that in cities like Aleppo that were devastated by Russian aircraft that were dropping bombs, both smart and dumb bombs, on Syrian cities, that the Assad regime would not allow generally journalists, particularly from the West, coverage. So one of the things I think is really important is that, and I've been impressed by, is all of the major networks, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, to be broadcasting live from cities, Mariupol, Kyiv, Lviv, Kherson, to covering what is actually going on the ground. Now, obviously, it's dangerous because we've seen journalists killed, but I think that is a really important coverage to push back against mis and disinformation. And the last thing I would just note is that during the Cold War, the U.S. was very successful at pushing information behind the Iron Curtain into Warsaw Pact countries and the Soviet Union through radio programs, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, satellite broadcasts, that the Soviets and the Czechoslovaks and the Poles and the West and the East Germans tried to jam, and it was this constant back and forth. We need to continue to support efforts to break that Russian firewall of information, and to get information into the Russian population through VPNs, through encrypted communications, so that people can download apps where they can get information to them that break through those firewalls. Because as we've seen, the Russians have basically stopped Facebook, Twitter, TikTok is almost all the current information is blocked on TikTok and is not showing up. So, but there are ways of getting through those what may be called the digital Iron Curtain, and there's a lot that the U.S. can do and get that information to Russians inside of Russia, so they can actually see what's going on.
Seth, being mindful of time, I'm going to turn to you and Mike for some closing comments. And Seth, I'll first turn to you and let our host, Secretary Walker, have the final word. Seth, what from today's conversations, both the ones you had earlier and the ones you've had here in this session, what should all this mean for the nation's Homeland Security practitioner community, and what should we really be thinking about in the days to come?
Well, I think what this highlights is that if there was any hope after this sort of end of a major focus on counterterrorism, it's been over 20 years since 9/11. If there was a hope by some that we could sort of pull ourselves back within our own borders and try to ignore much of the world, that is not going to happen right now. We see regimes in Beijing and in Moscow, and we've talked about the North Koreans and the Iranians, that have political, economic, and ideological worldviews that are diametrically opposed to the American support and the way our country was founded, free, open, democratic, capitalist system. And they will push and continue to push, whether it's in Ukraine or in Taiwan, in Hong Kong and other places, and inside of our borders, to weaken us and our system. And so what I would strongly just remind folks, and I think everybody knows this anyway, is this is not going to end quickly. However this war in Ukraine ends, A, it's probably not going to end quickly, and B, the broader competition will likely continue. And that will even go back to our conversations between the Russians and the Chinese. That competition will continue, and a very important battlefield will be in the United States. Mike's first question of the day, the U.S. homeland is a key battlefield. Cyber operations, sabotage, subversion, disinformation, and then the impact on issues like the economy, oil prices, gasoline prices, that will feel the effects of it here. So this will become, I think, in some ways, a bit of a new normal. So it's going to be, strap on your seatbelt and get ready for a ride that you may not wish were to occur, but I think is where we're headed.
Thank you, Seth. Mike, final thoughts?
Well, what we are probably going to see in the next coming days and weeks is going to horrify us, because Vladimir Putin wants to destroy Ukraine. That's what this is all about. I believe that future historians are probably going to say that the 21st century is defined by war between authoritarianism and democracy. And Ukraine is only the first battle in that war. It's clear democracy must prevail, because the kind of world that our children and grandchildren are going to inherit will depend on that.
Mike, Seth, thank you both for today's important conversations. And to our audience, on behalf of CHDS and our co-host organizations, thank you for joining us today. And we invite you to join us next Thursday, March 24th at 3 p.m. Eastern and 12 p.m. Pacific for the second part of this conversation, as Mike and Seth continue their consideration of America's homeland security threat and turn those discussions toward domestic issues. And if you're interested in learning more from Dr. Seth Jones about geopolitical threats, he'll be launching a course later this month as part of our self-study course. So as we close today, we'll show a little bit more information for you about that there. We thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you back here next week.